During the past few years, the news industry has been challenged as never before. But what are some of these challenges? And what's being done to address them? Find out on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. As more and more newspapers are put out of business, many communities lack the local news sources that they once had. Several grant-making organizations throughout the country are addressing this issue. On this show, my guests and I will talk about what one foundation is doing and the difference its grant funding is making for its media grantees. I'll be talking with Nicole Taylor, the Chief Executive Officer of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Joe Rodriguez, a co-founder and advisor at Mosaic, a Bay Area organization that offers professional training in journalism, and Mauricio Palma, the director of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation's Community Building Program, which incorporates the foundation's local journalism fund. Well, thank you so much to the three of you for joining me. I just now talked about some of the changes and challenges in the news industry, and I'm just wondering, I'd like to hear from the three of you. What do you think some of those challenges are?
I would love to hear from Joe, since he's a veteran of the industry, as we learned prior to the show beginning. Please, Joe.
Well, the primary challenge to all news media, and it isn't just newspapers where I worked, it's also television and magazines, is that advertising has abandoned the news media. Advertisers just don't need the news media to get word of their products out to the public. I'm sure all of us can relate to this, that when you buy something these days at the counter, the first thing they ask you for is not your wallet or your credit card, it's your email. And once they have your email, they can reach you directly. So that business model, dependent on advertisers, especially local advertisers, is broken, and we haven't really found a way to replace it. Journalism organizations need to monetize their product, they're still in a downward spiral, haven't quite done it. Online presents a possible answer. You can get today the Mercury News for $4 for 4 months. The Mercury News, you'll get it. You spend $4. The New York Times, you can get on unlimited online access for $17 a month. I don't know how long they can sustain that. It's just beginning. But the old business model is broken. They're looking hard and fast.
So Nicole, you asked Joe, and I'd like to find out from you precisely, why is the Silicon Valley Community Foundation involved in the changes going on in the news industry?
Right. Well, they predate just the most recent changes, and I'll have my colleague Mauricio speak to our history going back to 2014. One of the primary reasons we have gotten engaged and ramped up our engagement and our investment, especially over the past 18 months, is because of how critical local stories are and local information, as we were in a pandemic and where people were receiving their news and information, and how critical it was for them to understand what was happening in their neighborhoods, in their cities, in their counties, right here, right in their local, right where they live and work. And the national, news outlets, they weren't covering local. And, when you're online and social media, that can, as we know, can be, it just depends on what, what you're, what you subscribe to and what you follow. We really knew that it was important to lift up the stories, the local leaders, and the information. And the only way to do that was to invest in local journalism. So, and because the business model is no longer valid, and as Joe just laid out, I don't know how long they can sustain it. We felt philanthropy had to step in, particularly in the past, year to 18 months.
Yes, Mauricio, you're kind of overseeing the local journalism fund, are you?
I am. That's one of my many responsibilities, and it's an exciting responsibility to have at this particular time in history.
Sure. So tell us about the fund.
Yeah, so building on what Nicole shared with you, I think it's important to take a few steps back. In 2014, Silicon Valley Community Foundation was actually selected to be part of a national initiative funded by the Knight Foundation. This initiative was designed to answer one question, and that was how my community foundations support local journalism and inspire communities to play a greater role in civic life. In the process of kind of defining and implementing the initiative, we developed a partnership with Renaissance Journalism based here in the Bay Area. And after listening to many journalists and media leaders in the community, we learned that community foundations, as Nicole has stated, can play a critical role in addressing the news and information challenges we are facing by creating a space for journalists and community leaders to work together in the process of amplifying the untold or undertold stories in our region. So building on that experience, and thanks to Nicole's leadership, today we are actually able to say that we moved from experimentation to making a commitment to local journalism through the fund. And in the process of defining and doing this work, what we're really interested is in figuring out a way to not only invest in nonprofit organizations that are doing work in the space, but strengthening the ecosystem. And I would say a little bit more that this ecosystem, where we can see journalists and nonprofits at the center, Henrietta, it also engages philanthropy and the community leaders that are together working to make a difference in
So sure. Now, some might think the fund is only for nonprofits, right? It's not for corporate media organizations.
Right.
Now, some might think that that sets up a situation where there might be a conflict of interest, since journalists are supposed to be objective and not beholden to various groups or organizations. Or do you see any conflict, any situations that some might think would be situations of conflict?
I mean, I know I want to answer this, but I'd ask Joe or, as a recipient to answer from your perspective. From my perspective, we are just giving general support to these organizations and staying out of decision-making, staying out of the opinions, staying out of how they decide what they're going to work on, who they're going to report on, because we believe strongly in just giving that general support, and that we believe in good folks and they're going to do what to do with the resources. So for us, we're not trying to step over the line and try to influence what gets reported on and who gets reported on and who doesn't.
Sure, Joe.
When I was at the Mercury News, the paper did write about the Silicon Valley Community Foundation with a critical but objective eye. And Mosaic Journalism was not yet a grantee of the program. But if it were, then I would not have been allowed to cover the story because I'm too close to the grant. So so the paper would have and did assign a reporter to cover the foundation who was not involved with any of the groups that the foundation has been funding, which are quite numerous, I believe.
Right.
So,
right.
And this is a way the newspaper can ensure the reading public that it is striving to be objective in every way.
And that seems to be a really good way to handle it, is you assign, somebody who is disconnected from the source of the funds.
It's basically, the Mercury is the paper of record and a general interest paper. And the foundation is a general interest, the foundation of record, the most prominent in the Valley. So I think we're both giants in our own fields, and we know how to deal with each other.
Right.
An example that I would share where we have actually intentionally brought journalists to work with community leaders, and the facilitation has been made in part with the support of the Community Foundation, was around the census. What is important to underline, though, was that both the community leaders at the table, leading organizations interested in addressing the challenges with the census, and the nonprofit organizations doing journalism in our community, they were brought together, but not told what they should be working on. It was through the facilitated conversation that was done with Renaissance Journalism that the organizations identified 6 issue areas that they could work on in order to engage the hard-to-reach members of the community in the census. So we always try to stay back, but we intentionally create the space for these kinds of connections to do take place in our community.
Well, it certainly can be appreciated that the foundation feels that it can stay back, but I'm thinking in terms of the future, what might it mean when local news organizations are dependent upon donors and foundations for their funding?
Right.
Does that have what type of impact might that have in terms of how they present the news to their communities?
Well, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because many of the journalists who left the Mercury News through buyouts and downsizing and just flat out layoffs are now working for news organizations like Chalkbeat and Cal Matters that are funded primarily through Philanthropy, which I think is great. But you have to ask, well, how long are these philanthropists going to stay interested in local journalism? I still believe in an fully independent press that makes its own money. So I mean, you're only as independent as your bank account. And for the longest time, 250 years or so, the American press has been an independent, self-sustaining industry. That's changing. For now, I welcome the nonprofit sector, philanthropy supporting local journalism, and I hope they can do it so long as until the industry figures out a way to become financially fully independent. I hope it's in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Nicole, you're going to say something.
No, I was actually going to just piggyback that my bigger concern is about the sustainability and the interest of philanthropy as a field. Philanthropy can be cyclical, fickle, pick your adjective in terms of what it funds and when it funds. And it depends on, the nature of the foundation, or if they're going through a new strategic plan, or the board decides something different. Private foundation, community foundations, private individuals who support. That's tough for a long-term business model. That's tough. And that concerns me more, that we lose those voices and we lose the richness that those journalism outlets add to our communities. That concerns me far greater than your question about, how might they present themselves, because we've had a good tradition of, philanthropy staying in the background and letting the journalists do what they do best. So that's where I get really concerned, that we are going to lose these outlets and lose these voices.
Sure. Now,
may I add something,
yes,
Henrietta?
Mauricio, yes.
Yeah. So building on what both Joe and Nicole are offering us in response to your question, I also think it's important for us to take into consideration the type of nonprofit organizations that the Community Foundation is particularly interested in supporting. BIPOC-led organizations that are under $1 million in annual budget, and that have a race, equity, and social justice lens in the way in which they approach their work. And this set of nonprofit organizations, in my limited experience, and I'm not a journalist, I believe do not necessarily depend on the market to make a difference in their community. In fact, sometimes if they don't do their work in the communities, the stories of the people that they're covering do not get heard. So there is a different element here that the Community Foundation is trying to elevate, which is nonprofit organizations that have at their heart the basic interests of residents in communities of color throughout the region. And I don't know how you look at that, Joe, or you, Henrietta, as individuals that have a legacy in the field. And how do you see the role of those organizations in the context of the changes that are taking place for journalism throughout the country?
Sure, Joe, would you like to respond?
Sure. It's been a struggle for newspapers, especially, to look like the communities they cover. I think the heyday may have been the mid to late 1990s, but when the internet took over, and the aggregators like Google, Yahoo, and others basically ate the lunch of newspapers that were putting their content online for free and not getting any bounce back advertising. They started downsizing, and they were basically went into financial survival mode, and all these diversity initiatives and hiring just were pushed to the back burner. And so now again, you see shrunken newspapers, news media staffs that, some don't have a single Black reporter or Hispanic reporter. It's unfortunate, but as soon as the market tanked, they forgot about diversity.
So Mosaic is training journalists, and particularly journalists of color. Given how much the industry is downsizing, what are the prospects for those journalists?
That's one of our greatest challenges. We're trying to introduce minority students in poorer neighborhoods to this wonderful career. And it's I call it mission impossible. Let's be frank. They're coming. We're looking for students in schools that have no journalism. It's like if you're running a music camp in the summer and you're recruiting students from schools that don't have any music instructor and they don't have a single trumpet or violin. So how do you do that? Well, we go into these schools, like missionary work. We go to English classes and look for the best writers. The kids are aware of journalism, but it's usually not through a newspaper delivered to their homes. It's on Facebook. So they see us indirectly. At the same time, they have to resist the peer pressure and even family pressure to do something more lucrative. And in Silicon Valley, that means becoming a nerd, a graphic designer, a high-tech guy, or are they going to medicine? We get a lot of students who come to us anyway. They find us anyway, and they tell us, well, I'm going to major in pre-medicine when I go to San Jose State. And then I tell them, okay, then why are you in a journalism summer camp today? So they're resisting the pressure and finding us. And it's a matter of us finding them, and then they're finding us online and giving journalism a shot.
Well, I'm thinking that tech worker could very well be writing online about his tech work and interviewing his colleagues. And that doctor, I mean, there are medical journals and online news networks within medical organizations. So I'm thinking there's always a need for journalism skills. Don't you think?
I think so, and we're probably going to see more of that kind of, they call it citizen journalism. We might get into that in Mosaic as the program grows, but right now we're more interested in getting young aspiring journalists of color into the journalism pipeline, and that in itself is enough to keep us busy for a long time. There are groups in Southern California and nationally that are starting their citizenship training, and it seems to be working, but it's off to a slow start.
So
Henrietta,
yes.
Yeah.
I was going to call it anyway. Yeah.
I'm sorry to be interrupting so much, but your question reminded me of why we saw Mosaic Journalism as a organization that was in alignment with the criteria of the local journalism fund. And by the way, we were supported by a group of community advisory councils that work with Nicole and support Nicole in looking at strategies that the Community Foundation is designing and implementing, and they helped us in the selection process. But in their review, one thing that surfaced with regards to Mosaic Journalism was that, and this is a statement that I'm paraphrasing, Mosaic Journalism goes beyond journalism. And I was like, what do you mean it goes beyond journalism? And they said, well, it goes beyond journalism because journalism is not the end of what they're hoping to build for the community. And the way in which this reviewer read the application, and I was writing some notes as I was listening to Joe, he said that Mosaic Journalism is building the capacity of youth to be critical thinkers and to be engaged in civil society as a consequence of those skills. So it goes beyond journalism because the end result might not be a career in journalism, but it could be a young person, man, woman, who is engaged in shaping our community for the better of all.
Yeah.
Yes, with skills in research, skills in writing, skills in interviewing, skills in getting to the very heart of an issue. That there are all kinds of accompanying skills that are developed. Now, Mauricio, you talked about collaborating with community leaders. And this is a question that I throw out to Joe, which can also be addressed by Nicole. Given that the role of a journalist is to get to the truth and present that truth, in many instances, if a journalist is doing his or her work correctly, they would not be collaborating with community leaders. So they might be investigating community leaders.
Mhm.
So are we setting up a situation that might negatively affect the role of journalists in their communities in having them collaborate with
Yeah. What do you
community
think,
leaders?
Joe? What do you think?
Well, let's like to answer it this way. I have been the director of Mosaic since the beginning in 1993, and as such, I was not the one out there doing the reporting. I sort of assumed the same role as a newspaper publisher or news station owner, and these folks do not so much collaborate, but they're in contact with, and they sometimes pal around with the powers that be in town. I once gave a speech warning against that at Southern College a long time ago, and I could see the local publisher who paid for the banquet, big frown. I said, "Don't get too close to the power brokers that your paper covers." But that paper and at ours, it was the reporters. You trust your editors and reporters to cover the foundations, the people in power, nonprofit and for-profit, honestly and objectively. And we do that with our students in the Mosaic Journalism Workshop. They don't run around giving speeches on behalf of the newspaper. That's for us, the directors, to do. So I mean, newspapers and TV stations are powerful institutions in their communities, and if we just jump into bed with the powers that be, our readers, and especially readers in impoverished communities, will see us as not on their side.
Right.
Yes, Nicole.
Yeah, and Joe's right, and that's the opposite of what our intent is. You know, our intent is to have local journalism flourish, and this is about journalism and the values, the ethics, the training that goes into being a good journalist, and not just somebody who doesn't have the training, doesn't actually understand the field out there, right? We are really supporting these organizations that are trying to uphold the best standards of journalism, and which speaks to what Joe was talking about. Put that brick wall between the editors and the journalists, and then the people who have to try to get the money so that the editors and the journalists can do what they need to do. But that has been our intent as a funder and our fellow funders and donors. It is not about trying to influence, it is trying to just ensure that local journalism survives and thrives. And right now it feels to us that they're just trying to survive. And, we are trying to figure out and get more donors engaged to get more support so that the sector, local journalism sector, can move beyond survival. So I'm hopeful that it won't become untenable and it won't become a question of ethics and people stepping over the lines when they need to be, or that the people doing the funding start pressuring in just an unfair and immoral way.
Well, that's quite interesting because there are more and more news organizations. Those that are surviving are becoming nonprofits. So, Mauricio, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think that it's important for us to see the value of collaboration. Given everything that has been said about the need for journalism to be autonomous, to not be influenced by those in power. When we're talking about collaboration, this is what we are referring to. When the census was being implemented, there was a lot of information that was not necessarily known by everyone engaged. And so the idea of bringing folks together is so that they can hear the information together and identify spaces where they can address the challenges in ways that would be different if they were completely separate from one another. The same thing happened around the issue of housing. One of the things that we did with Renaissance journalism was to identify the areas where news and information lacked, depth of information, and opportunities for us to understand solutions related to that information. And those three areas were housing, education, and immigration. We're talking about the Bay Area. We're talking about organizations that are working in the Bay Area. And in part, the journalists themselves looked at the value of engaging leaders that are working on these areas, nonprofit leaders now, because often those stories are do not make it to mainstream media. So it's about creating opportunities for information to be brought forward that would not otherwise. And that's the kind of collaboration that I'm referring to as I talk about that.
Yeah. Now, Nicole talked about the nature of philanthropy in general, in that next year there might be a different emphasis, or the year after there might be a different emphasis. What is it that determines the area that the Silicon Valley Community Foundation will focus on?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. When I got here in late 2018, I was committed to rebuilding the culture and values of the foundation, which the staff had already put so much time and energy into, and they were well on their way. And I was also committed in putting the community back in the community foundation. So because of that, when we were going through our strategic planning process to decide our strategic direction, we listened to what the community was saying. We had town halls, we had interviews, we had design labs, and that helped shape our priorities. And our priorities, we have 4 of them, and it allows us to be responsive to the community needs while also going deep on some key areas for the long term. So one of our key priorities is reducing systemic disparities. And we're going to go deep in early childhood development, in financial security and housing. And we're also going to ensure that we're staying in tune with what our communities are saying is needed. Another priority is creating a strong and engaged community. And that's where Mauricio's area of work really comes in, and that we can each year take a look at where is our community struggling the most, and how do we ensure that we're responding to that while we continue to build upon the work that was done in the prior year. And one of the key ways for us to do that is working with our donors. And so our third priority is developing a culture of effective philanthropy, not just for our donors, but for the region. How do we get the word out on what our communities need, but also what's working, right? What are the things that are working? What's having impact? How do we actually get donors and philanthropists to understand and make that connection so that those investments can be made over and over, year, and build on what the good is, so that we can really create a much more equitable Silicon Valley than we have today. And then just our fourth priority is about becoming a trusted and enduring institution for this community. And I think by keeping community centered and keeping equity centered, that will allow us to always stay in tune with the needs in the community and what's working.
Well, what you just now outlined, particularly when it comes to reducing systemic racism or disparity, is a long-term goal, I would think. And that's not something that's going to be done immediately.
No, it's not. And that is our long-term commitment. We are going to stay on that for the long term. And in the short term, we had COVID, right? And we were still coming out of the pandemic. We will always be responding to emerging needs in the community. We were figuring out a way. It's not either or, right? It's both. We keep the long-term view. We have to keep the long-term view for our communities to be better. And we respond to what is needing in the emerging needs of the community. And we do that through funds like that Mauricio is overseeing, these short-term funds that can get to smaller organizations and really get deep in the communities. You know, racial justice. So we cared about racial justice for a long time. After George Floyd's murder, the volume turned up for everybody around that. And we had to respond, and we wanted to respond. We'll continue working on racial justice as an example, but it also, you know, once all of the AAPI hate incidents were happening against our Asian and Asian American, you know, neighbors and fellow citizens and fellow residents, you know, we wanted to respond to that as well. So we keep the long-term view, and we also make sure that we are relevant to what is happening and where the needs are of our community at the same time.
Sure. Now, Joe, as a grantee of the foundation, what's your priority as far as the long-term view and the short-term view when it comes to the use of the funding?
Well, our number one goal remains to reach out to young aspiring journalists of color and introducing them and inspiring them to pursue this career. With the grant that we want from the foundation, we plan to expand Mosaic into a year-round program, beginning with a pilot. We're going to work with about a dozen or more local high school students, mostly from East San Jose and downtown, covering their communities with an emphasis on social justice, race, and equal opportunity. Given, you know, that we're still in COVID, so COVID, as journalists are going to follow the news, but even in COVID, you can look at issues of equal treatment by the county health department, outreach, and things like that. Is it fair? So we'll guide these young journalists covering the community. And one thing that sets us apart from regular scholastic journalism is that we don't have them cover their own campuses. We're not interested in the new uniforms for the football team. So they go out and cover real news in the community. And we hope that, as in the past, that these journalists will go back to their schools in the East Side and downtown and start journalism clubs, so that many more students can have that same opportunity. And in future years, we hope that if philanthropists, here and elsewhere, see our program, will fund us at a higher level. And we hope to work with students from at least 20 schools in San Jose. We'll expand it. We'll bring in East Palo Alto, Oakland, maybe even San Francisco. But our home base is still Silicon Valley.
So as you expand into East Palo Alto, you're expanding into our territory.
That's right. Are you ready for the competition?
Well, they say competition is good and competition makes it sharper. So Maybe,
Collaboration.
I was going to
100%,
say,
right.
maybe there might be some
Yeah, I wanted to add that.
areas of collaboration. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to add also that, touching on what Mauricio mentioned earlier, is that it's more than just local journalism that we're introducing these young people to. We try to give them a global view of their communities, the understanding that there are national, international forces affecting them, and we really want to send them off to college with that all around knowledge of their communities and of their future. Most of our students don't go into journalism. But more than half go into related fields involving writing, communications, and academia. We did a survey of our students way back in 2012 of our alumni, and 13% actually became full-time working journalists. Santa Clara University said, that's a pretty good batting average. And the fact that more than half go into related fields proves that our method works, and our method is based on introducing them to real journalism as it is done in industry newspapers and news stations.
Well, before I pose a question for Mauricio, I'd like to know, since you're working with high school students, does the training that you provide them take the place of college journalism classes?
We tell them that, after 2 weeks in our summer camp, they will know much more journalism than the average college freshman who's just entering the field. They start off right away. We send a lot to San Jose State, where usually you cannot work on the campus newspaper until your junior year. But once they hear that our students have been through Mosaic, they can start writing for the campus paper right away.
Yes. Now, Mauricio, Nicole talked about the long-term and some of the short-term goals. What long-term and short-term goals does the foundation have for the local journalism fund?
Well, in the short term, we'd like to circle back to that friendly competition that you talked about. We are creating a cohort, which is a space to bring together all the grantees that are recipients of the fund to share stories, to share skills, to take a look at what everyone is doing, and hopefully create opportunities for collaboration. What's interesting is that 6 out of the 13 organizations are working on youth-related programs, and that's what we are supporting. So there is a theme that by accident surfaced from the participating grantees. So in the short term, creating that space to be able to generate support that's relevant to the organizations that are participating. Long term, I'm going to repeat something that Nicole already said, and that is that we're committed to local journalism, and we're looking for ways and strategies to engage donors and funders in our region to help support journalism that's taking place in our community. That's the long-term vision that we have beyond any one grant that we provide, is to figure out ways to amplify the support given to the field.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well said, Mauricio.
Sure. And I'm just wondering, we've talked a lot, and I'm about different aspects of the fund and different challenges facing the news industry as a whole. And I'm just wondering, Joe talked about finding new models
Mm.
for the industry. What do you think that new model each of you might look like? And do you think it's something that could be developed from the funding of local journalism organizations, local media outlets?
Much has been talked about the nonprofit model for, let's say, papers like the Mercury News, the Morgan Hill paper, big and small, but at the local level, of their becoming nonprofits, or being bought by very wealthy business tycoons here, and who would then take them into and turn them into nonprofits. But I think those newspapers will have to find a way to win back advertisers and at least break even. Otherwise, the tycoons will abandon them. So they still have to make a profit. I mean, nonprofit world is still the business world.
Right.
You have to make money. You have to pay the staff. You got to pay off your debts. You have to recruit new talent, pay them decently. And so the question is, okay, how do nonprofit newspapers and TV stations do that, win back advertisers? You might see a merger of television, radio, and newspapers. So instead of competing with each other every day, they join forces and pool the information and truths collected by their combined staffs. Another idea is for the government to make the subscription fee to newspapers tax deductible. I don't like that too much because, of course, I'm for separation of government and the press. It has to be fully independent. So those are the few things that people in the industry are talking about.
Sure. Nicole, Maurice?
Yeah, well, in a little bit, around that tax deduction piece, and advertisers, is how can there be a business model where the readership is supportive, right? Mm-hmm. And if there's a way to tie that to the advertising so that the advertisers see that there's a readership and it's worth their time. And I don't know how that, I think there's something in there. I don't know what that looks like, but it's got to be worth the advertiser's while, or worth, other than advertising, worth an investment from the private sector over the long term, either that or worth the investment of the individuals who put their eyes on it, right, each day and read or listen to the journalism. It's to me, it's one or maybe both or some hybrid of the two. That there's a way to capitalize on the value that people see in these local journalism efforts. And maybe if people start seeing their own stories in these efforts, and maybe if they start seeing that they are reflected far better in local journalism than national stories that national outlets put out, and that it's relevant for their day-to-day life, that maybe that's how we get there. So, how can philanthropy have that risk capital? A lot of times we say philanthropy provides the risk capital. We do things that the public sector or private sector may not be willing to do right off the bat. But what if we help amplify that and show the value of that, so that then the sector can figure out those business models and take the time to figure out those business models. So that's the best thinking I have on this at the moment.
Sure, Mauricio.
Yeah, the question makes me think of, back to what we've been talking about, communities that do not often see themselves reflected in the stories in our mainstream newspapers. So I'm thinking of the Maya community in the Bay Area. I'm thinking of the African diaspora, and they're concentrated, in the East Bay and in San Jose. I'm thinking of the Latinx community. I'm thinking of the Asian community, Vietnamese community, and and the African American community. And when I think of these communities that we are working with at the Community Foundation, the best way that I can respond to your question is that we need to be able to see the connection of digital uh, platforms that allow for greater democratization of the flow of information in communities. I'm thinking of models where information is shared that leads to action. And I think that digital media, which might not necessarily be a platform that everyone can right now invest in, definitely is a space that needs to be looked at more intentionally, as many of those communities that I mentioned have the tools already, basic phones that they can utilize to access information that's critical to their day-to-day experience in our community.
One of the biggest changes, I would think, threats to the news industry over the past few years has been this idea of fake news and the loss of credibility. So if you're going to have the community supporting its media institutions, what has to be done in terms of building up that credibility?
Well, I remember when the former immediate past president called the press the enemy of the people.
Yes.
I mean, we were stung. We didn't know how to respond because no president before had ever said anything like that. Others had, but not the president. And I was disappointed in the response of most major newspapers and media. We didn't fight back. We didn't launch crusades on TV or however to educate the public about our true role. And so I think we have to do that. I mean, it's already ingrained in a large segment of the votership in this country that the press is the enemy. And reporters are now down there with lawyers as the least respected professionals. That's got to change. We have to bring back the stature of journalism. We have to bring back the spirit of the paper of the papers that covered the Nixon administration, that toppled presidents, that revealed the truth behind misbegotten wars. So we have a long road to hoe, but we can do it. We just have to get over the shock and get used to the fact that we now have to defend our profession, especially on social media.
Yes.
Yeah.
And oh yes, you're going to say something more.
No. I was in agreement with Joe. It's what I'm hoping, and maybe I'm being too naive, is that enough people have seen the tragedy around actual fake news and what that has done to their local communities, that they recognize that they need true news sources for information that are vital to how they live and work. I'm still holding out hope that people are starting to realize that there's such an important role for journalism to play in our society.
Yes, Mauricio.
Yeah. So I know you haven't asked this of me, but as a way of answering the question, I'm an immigrant originally from Nicaragua. I've been here longer than I ever was in Nicaragua. But I remember as a kid that journalists were being criminalized because they demanded democracy. Journalists died because they were working to bring about change in the society. And I see, as a consequence of that experience, a much, much closer connection between journalism and community that maybe is the standard in our society.
Mm.
So when the former president criminalized journalists for doing their work, it was not new to me. Many communities of color have been criminalized for asking for food, for shelter in this society.
Mm.
But I do believe that what happened over the past year and a half, and Nicole did a beautiful job in describing what occurred as a consequence of the murder of George Floyd and what happened in our community as a consequence of hate crime, specifically targeting the Asian community. What I see journalists doing that come from the, from Black America, from Latino America, and from Asian American communities in the US is to talk about themselves in the context of everything that's going on. And I think that this is a way to build trust. This is a way to go beyond the challenges posed by fake news in our community. When journalists put themselves in the heart of the challenges that our community face, not to take a position one way or the other, but to tell the stories that really help us better understand the pain, the joy, and the aspirations that our community has.
Sure. Social media kind of brought back or led to the disruption of traditional media.
Mm-hmm.
So how can media outlets take back the power that they had?
Yeah.
Or through social media, or what can be done?
If I could answer that question, I'd become a news media tycoon. I mean,
Work on it, Joe.
you're right. I think all news media is trying to capitalize on social media. That's because that's where the people are. That's where the eyeballs are going, and the advertisers are going there. Whatever we've done hasn't really helped. But that's one of those challenges that social media looks to be, for now, one possible new business model we can tap. We just don't know how. There's lots of experimenting going on, primarily with the big papers, the New York Times and the LA Times. But nobody has hit that vein of gold yet on social media. But there are a lot of people more smarter than me thinking that it's there somewhere. Let's keep trying.
Sure. Final words, Nicole, Mauricio. Joe says, let's keep trying.
Right. Well, I just want to go back to the importance of supporting local journalism and ensuring that we do, not just supporting the journalists. Now I'm like, how do we support the innovation that needs to happen around the business model? That's another thing that philanthropy could provide some risk capital and maybe help some of the experimentation along, as I've been sitting here thinking about it, and the importance of just all of us just doing the great work. And if anybody watching this thinks that it's impossible to be objective with a funder, Henrietta did not let up on the hard questions.
Oh.
So I wouldn't worry about that.
Oh, Nicole, thank you.
You asked me, really, really, you didn't let up, and I'm glad you didn't. That is your role. That's Joe's role. That's what Joe's teaching these young people. So thank you both for what you do.
Well, thank you so much for your responses. Mauricio, the last word.
I just want to say thank you, Henrietta. Really, it's been a pleasure, and to be able to be part of this conversation. It's very important for us, and you're helping us not only tell the story of the work of the Community Foundation, but the work that many folks like you and Joe are doing in our community. So thank you for creating the space for those stories through your work.
Well, I'd like to thank the three of you. This space would have been empty without your participation, and you've given a lot of ideas. And I'd like to thank you for your support as a media organization, for supporting media outlets. And thanks again for joining me for this very important discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that's it. You've heard about some of the challenges facing the news industry and some of the positive efforts being made to address them. Join me for the next critical discussion on Talking with Henrietta.